Jaden sat at his desk, his fingers drumming nervously against the edge of his notebook. The classroom was buzzing with the usual chatter, students talking about the weekend, gossiping about the latest trends, and complaining about their homework. But Jaden was lost in his own world, as usual. He had learned to block out the noise, to fade into the background where he could go unnoticed. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. But today was different. "Jaden," Miss Thompson's voice sliced through the air, sharp and commanding. He froze, his heart suddenly racing. He looked up, meeting her cold, expectant gaze. Miss Thompson was the kind of teacher who loved to pick on the quiet kids, and Jaden had always been her favorite target. Her eyes narrowed as she locked onto him, her lips curling into a thin, disapproving line. "Could you please tell the class your thoughts on the assignment? You've been awfully quiet today." The room fell silent. Every eye was on him now, waiting for him to speak. Jaden could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, his stomach flipping as he opened his mouth. The words didn't come out right, and he quickly closed his mouth again, unsure of what to say. Ms. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Well, don't just sit there like you have nothing to say. This is important." Her tone was condescending, like she was speaking to a child. "You know, it's been a pattern with you, Jaden. I don't think you even care about this class. You're just here because you have to be." A few snickers echoed from the back of the room. Jaden's throat tightened. He hated being the center of attention, especially when it felt like everyone was laughing at him. Ms. Thompson continued, oblivious to the discomfort she was causing. "Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention, you'd actually have something worthwhile to contribute. It's not too late to start caring about your future." Jaden's hands balled into fists under the desk. He could feel the weight of her words like a heavy stone pressing down on his chest. But there was nothing he could do. He was used to this. He had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't fit in. No matter how hard he tried, he always seemed to fall short in Ms. Thompson's eyes. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Ms. Thompson didn't offer him any encouragement, didn't say a word as the other students began to pack up their things and leave. Jaden remained seated, staring at the desk in front of him, wishing he could disappear. As the last student left the room, Ms. Thompson gave him one final look. "You know, Jaden," she said, her voice softer now, but still laced with judgment, "you could do so much better if you just tried." With that, she walked out, leaving Jaden alone in the empty classroom. The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating him. He hated feeling like this, like he was always being judged, always falling short. But what could he do? He was just Jaden. The quiet, invisible kid who didn't fit the mold. As he gathered his things and slowly walked out of the classroom, he could feel the weight of the entire day pressing down on him. He wasn't the kind of person who sought attention or wanted to stand out. He just wanted to get through the day without anyone noticing him. But that wasn't possible, not with people like Ms. Thompson around. She made sure everyone knew exactly where they stood in her eyes. He stepped into the hallway, the noise of students talking and laughing filling the space. He walked past them, his shoulders hunched, eyes focused on the floor. He couldn't bear to look up, not when he knew everyone could see the shame on his face. They probably thought he was just another kid who didn't care, just another lost cause. "Hey, Jaden, you alright?" Jaden looked up, startled. It was Megan, one of the more popular girls in school. She had a kind smile on her face, but Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that she was just trying to be nice. He'd never been close to Megan, and she wasn't someone he thought would care about how he was feeling. "I'm fine," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want to talk. He just wanted to go home and hide away from the world for a while. He didn't need anyone to pity him. Megan seemed to notice his unease, but she didn't press the issue. "All right, if you say so. I just wanted to check on you. Don't let Ms. Thompson get to you, okay?" Jaden nodded, even though he wasn't sure how to take her words. He had heard the rumors about Megan, how she was popular, how she could get anyone to like her. He didn't fit in with people like her, and he doubted she truly cared about someone like him. But for a brief moment, the kindness in her voice made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there were people who didn't see him as a failure. As he walked through the crowded hallways, his thoughts began to swirl. What was the point? Why even bother trying to fit in, to be seen, when people like Ms. Thompson would always make him feel small? He felt invisible, like no matter how hard he tried, he was never enough. But then, something inside him shifted. A quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if I didn't have to fit in? What if I could show them something they didn't expect?" He wasn't sure where the thought came from, but it lingered in his mind as he walked toward his next class. He couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had something to offer the world after all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jaden walked slowly to his next class, the weight of Ms. Thompson's words still hanging heavily in his chest. He tried to shake it off, but the sting of being dismissed and mocked was hard to ignore. For as long as he could remember, he'd always been the quiet one, the one who slipped under the radar. He had never been part of any group or cliques, never been one to cause a scene. Instead, he stayed to himself, keeping his thoughts locked inside where no one could see them. Growing up, Jaden had always felt different. His mother, Carla, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. She was a strong, resilient woman, but even she couldn't hide the strain that came with trying to provide for her son on her own. Jaden didn't mind too much. He knew how hard she worked and how much she sacrificed for him. He'd learned to take care of himself from a young age, always trying to be the good kid, the one who didn't cause trouble. But the world outside their small apartment was anything but kind. The neighborhood was tough, and Jaden had seen things that no child should ever have to see. Violence, drugs, and crime were part of the everyday landscape. Most kids in his area had to grow up fast, learning to protect themselves or fall victim to the harsh realities of life. Jaden tried to avoid all of that, retreating into his own world. His mother would often tell him stories about her own childhood, about the dreams she had before life knocked her down. And though Jaden could see the pain in her eyes when she spoke about it, he also saw the hope that still lived within her. It was that same hope that Jaden clung to, even when it seemed impossible. His mom always encouraged him to pursue his passions, no matter how difficult life became. She saw something in him that Jaden hadn't fully recognized yet, the potential to be more than just another statistic. One of Jaden's first loves had always been music. The piano, in particular, was something that called to him. It wasn't just the sound, it was the escape it provided. When Jaden sat down at the old, creaky keyboard in their living room, the outside world melted away. The keys felt like an extension of himself, each note telling a story he couldn't put into words. Music had become his refuge, the only place where he felt truly free. But Jaden never played for anyone. Not really. His mother had encouraged him, of course, always telling him how talented he was, but Jaden had always been too shy to share it with anyone else. The few times he'd played for her, he had always felt like he was under some sort of microscope, waiting for her to critique or judge him. The fear of being seen, truly seen, had kept him locked in his own head. See, at school, things weren't much better. Jaden had tried to make friends, but it always felt like he was on the outside looking in. The other kids had their groups, their inside jokes, and their own sense of belonging. Jaden didn't fit in with any of them. He was too quiet for the extroverts, too different for the more popular kids. And the bullies? They always knew exactly who to target, the kid who didn't stand out, the one who never fought back. Jaden had learned to keep his head down, to stay out of sight. It was easier that way. Easier to avoid confrontation, easier to keep his pain hidden behind a mask of indifference. But inside, it was a different story. Inside, Jaden often felt like he was screaming, trapped in a world where no one saw him for who he really was. It wasn't that he didn't want to be noticed. It was just that he didn't think anyone would ever care enough to notice him in the first place. And every time someone, like Ms. Thompson, reminded him of that, it made the wound a little deeper. At home, his mother did her best to comfort him, but even she couldn't change the reality of their lives. They were scraping by, just barely making it. Carla often came home late at night, exhausted from work, but she still found time to check in on Jaden, to make sure he was doing okay. She'd tell him stories of her own struggles, about how she'd grown up in a similar neighborhood, how she'd fought to build a better life for him. "I want you to know, Jaden, that no matter how hard things get, you've got something special," she'd say, sitting beside him on the couch after a long day. "You're different, and that's a good thing. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." Jaden would nod, but part of him didn't believe her. He wanted to. He wanted to believe that he was special, that he could make a difference. But how could he when everyone around him only saw him as invisible? How could he when even his teacher, someone who was supposed to help him, treated him like he was nothing more than a statistic? He would never forget the time his mom had taken him to see a concert at a local theater. It was a small venue, but the music had been beautiful, something so pure and powerful that Jaden felt like he was floating. When they left, his mom had turned to him with a smile and said, "One day, Jaden. I know you'll be up there on that stage. I believe in you." The thought of performing in front of a crowd, of sharing his music with the world, had seemed impossible back then. But it was a dream that Jaden carried with him, tucked away deep inside. It was a dream that kept him going, even when the world felt like it was working against him. That dream was the one thing he held on to when everything else seemed to fall apart. It was the one thing that made him feel like he had a purpose, even when everything else in his life seemed uncertain. As Jaden walked through the hallways of his high school, lost in his thoughts, he could hear the laughter and chatter of the other students around him. He felt like an outsider in his own school, the walls of the hallways closing in on him. He couldn't help but wonder if he would ever escape the loneliness, if he would ever truly find his place in the world. But deep down, in the quiet recesses of his heart, Jaden knew one thing for sure: he wasn't done yet. He had something to prove, not just to Ms. Thompson or the other students, but to himself. He had dreams, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make them come true. The following days were a blur of assignments, tests, and the usual monotony of high school life. Jaden did his best to stay out of everyone's way, trying to avoid confrontation, avoiding being seen. But despite his best efforts, Ms. Thompson's words continued to echo in his mind. Her dismissal, her mockery, felt like a crack in his armor, one that only seemed to grow wider with every passing day. He found it difficult to focus in class. His mind would wander back to that moment when Ms. Thompson had belittled him in front of everyone. He wasn't stupid, he knew exactly what she had done. She'd called him out on purpose. She'd tried to break him down, to make him feel small, insignificant. And she had succeeded. For a while, at least. But then, something began to shift inside him. It was subtle at first, a quiet stir in the back of his mind. He'd never been the rebellious type, the one to stand up for himself or push back against authority. But now, there was a flicker of defiance, something that made him question why he should keep accepting the role of the invisible kid, the one who didn't matter. In the middle of another monotonous history class, Jaden felt the familiar tug in his chest. The yearning to be seen, to be heard. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping anxiously on his notebook. His mind wasn't on the lesson, but instead on the music that always seemed to haunt him. The piano, the keys, the melody that had been locked away for so long. What if he could just get up, leave this classroom, and go to the one place that felt like home, the piano? Jaden's eyes drifted over to the side of the classroom, where the school's music room was located. The door was slightly ajar, and from where he sat, he could see the gleam of the grand piano just inside. For a moment, he felt a surge of longing. What if he could walk in there and just play? Forget about everything else for a while and lose himself in the music? As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Jaden's thoughts were already racing. He shoved his books into his bag and stood up quickly, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the classroom. The hallway was crowded as students poured out of their classes, but Jaden didn't hesitate. He walked quickly, making his way down the familiar corridor toward the music room. His heart raced in his chest as he pushed open the door. The room was empty, save for the piano. It was the only place in the entire school where Jaden felt he could truly breathe. He walked over to it, running his fingers along the cool surface of the keys. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar sensation wash over him. The sound of the piano was like an old friend, and for a brief moment, Jaden allowed himself to relax, to be present in the music. He took a deep breath and began to play. At first, his fingers moved hesitantly, but as the music flowed from him, he felt a sense of peace. Each note was like a release, a freedom he couldn't find anywhere else. The melody grew stronger, more confident, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jaden allowed himself to lose himself in the music. But then, the door creaked open. Jaden stopped mid-song, his fingers hovering over the keys. He turned to see Ms. Thompson standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on him with an unreadable expression. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone flat, almost disinterested. "This is the music room. Shouldn't you be in class?" Jaden swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, he wasn't supposed to be here. The music room wasn't a place for students to wander in and out of freely. It was meant for music students, for those who actually cared about their studies. But Jaden hadn't been invited here, hadn't been given permission. Still, he couldn't bring himself to apologize. Not this time. "I just wanted to play," Jaden said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Thompson didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there, her eyes scrutinizing him. Jaden felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she could see right through him. She had a way of making him feel like everything about him was wrong, like his very presence was a mistake. Finally, she spoke. "Well, I hope you know that this isn't the place for you to be wasting your time. There are students who actually care about their futures, who work hard and do what they're supposed to. I'm not sure where you fit into that picture, Jaden, but this," she gestured dismissively toward the piano, "this won't get you anywhere." Jaden's blood ran cold at her words. He felt the familiar sting of rejection, the same sting he'd felt countless times before, but something inside him snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. He wasn't going to let her define him, wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, tell him what he was capable of. Without thinking, Jaden's fingers hit the keys with a sudden force, creating a sharp, dissonant sound that reverberated through the room. The music, once soft and flowing, now felt jagged, raw, almost defiant. His hands moved faster, the notes coming in a flurry of energy. He wasn't playing for Ms. Thompson anymore. He wasn't playing for anyone. He was playing for himself. Ms. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, watching him as his music filled the room. Jaden's heart raced, not from fear or anxiety, but from the thrill of doing something just for himself. For the first time, he wasn't concerned with what others thought of him. The music was his, and he was finally allowing himself to be a part of it. When he finished, the room fell silent. Jaden's chest was heaving, his hands trembling slightly from the intensity of what he had just played. For a moment, he stood there, waiting for Ms. Thompson's judgment. But it never came. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room without saying another word. Jaden stood there, alone, for what felt like an eternity. But something had changed. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't invisible anymore. Not to himself, at least. He had taken the first step in standing up for who he was, in showing the world a part of himself that he'd kept hidden for far too long. As the door clicked shut behind Ms. Thompson, Jayden allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Jayden walked home that afternoon with a new energy in his step. The usual weight that pressed down on his shoulders had lifted, if only for a moment. As he made his way down the familiar streets, he replayed the scene in the music room over and over in his mind. The way his fingers had danced across the piano keys, the power he'd felt as the music poured from him, it was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been missing. It was as if the music had unlocked something deep inside him, something he'd been too afraid to tap into. For the first time in a long while, Jayden felt like he could breathe. When he arrived home, his mom was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hand, a tired but warm smile on her face. The exhaustion was still evident in her eyes, but she always managed to make time for Jayden. She noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Hey, you look different. Something happened today?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jayden hesitated for a moment. How could he explain what had just happened? How could he put into words the whirlwind of emotions he'd experienced in the music room? But there was a part of him that knew his mom would understand. She always did. "I played," Jayden said simply, his voice still a bit shaky. "In the music room. Ms. Thompson, she didn't like it, but I didn't care. I just played." His mom's face softened. She stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jayden," she said quietly. "I know it's not always easy, but you have something inside of you that's special. You can't let anyone make you feel like it's not worth anything." Jayden felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words, how much he needed to be reminded that he wasn't alone in this. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Jayden admitted, looking down at the floor. "I'm not sure if it will make a difference. Ms. Thompson, she probably thinks I'm a joke." His mom's voice was firm, but full of warmth. "Forget about Ms. Thompson. You don't need her approval. What you're doing is for you, not her. And you're not a joke, Jayden. You're not. You're a young man with a dream. And dreams are worth chasing." Jayden looked up at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. She was right. It didn't matter what Ms. Thompson thought, or what anyone else thought for that matter. He had something inside of him, a gift, that he wasn't going to keep buried anymore. He was going to fight for it, for his music, for himself. The next day at school, Jayden didn't walk the halls with the same sense of fear he had grown accustomed to. There was still a lingering unease, but it was tempered by a newfound resolve. He knew that Ms. Thompson would be watching him, perhaps waiting for him to fail. But Jayden wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. He entered the music room again, this time with a quiet confidence. The familiar scent of polished wood and sheet music filled the air, and there, sitting in front of the grand piano, Jayden felt like he was finally in the right place. He sat down, his fingers brushing against the keys, the anticipation building inside of him. The last time he had played, he had done it out of a need to prove something. This time, it was different. This time, he was playing for himself. Jayden closed his eyes and let his fingers find the right notes. The music began, soft at first, but soon it grew in intensity, flowing with a rhythm and power that he hadn't known he was capable of. It was as if the piano was alive, responding to him, guiding him through every note, every chord. For the first time, Jayden felt in control of the music, and it felt like everything he had ever wanted was coming together. And then, the door opened again. Jayden didn't flinch. He didn't stop playing. This time, he wasn't afraid. Ms. Thompson stood there, watching him, her arms crossed, her gaze unreadable. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Jayden saw something in her expression. Was it surprise? Disbelief? It was hard to tell, She didn't speak at first, and neither did Jaden. He just played. Played for all the times he had been dismissed, for all the moments he had been overlooked. Played for the parts of himself he had hidden away for so long. When he finished, the room was still. Jaden's fingers rested gently on the keys, his heart racing in his chest. He waited for Ms. Thompson's judgment, but this time, it didn't come. Instead, she nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. "You've got talent, Jaden," she said quietly, her tone softer than he had ever heard it. "I can't deny that." Jaden's breath caught in his throat. The words weren't much, but they were enough. It was the first time Ms. Thompson had acknowledged him in any way other than criticism. It was a small victory, but to Jaden, it felt monumental. He didn't say anything in response. There was nothing more to say. He had already won. When Jaden left the music room that day, something inside him had shifted again. The weight that had once pressed so heavily on his shoulders had lifted. The journey he was on wasn't going to be easy, and there would be plenty of challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them. He wasn't just a boy with a dream anymore. He was a young man with a purpose. And no matter what anyone thought, no matter how hard it got, Jaden was going to fight for that purpose. Because, for the first time, he finally believed in himself. The days following Jaden's moment in the music room felt like a blur, but a good blur. A blur filled with possibilities, new opportunities, and a sense of excitement that he hadn't experienced in ages. He walked through the halls of the school with his head held a little higher, a quiet determination in his step. The feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time, was intoxicating. It wasn't just the acknowledgement from Ms. Thompson that had changed things. It was something deeper, something that Jaden couldn't quite put into words. The piano had given him a voice, a way to express himself that nothing else ever had. And with that came a new sense of freedom, a freedom that, for once, didn't come with fear. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. As the days went by, Jaden began to notice a shift. People at school were talking. His classmates who had never really acknowledged him before were now whispering when he walked by. He caught glimpses of them staring as if they were waiting for something, something big, something that would define him in their eyes. And as much as he wanted to believe it was all positive, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be free from obstacles. It all came to a head during one of his classes a week later. Jaden had just returned from the music room, his fingers still tingling from the last piece he'd played, when he entered the classroom and saw a group of his peers gathered near the back. Their eyes flickered to him as he walked in, and suddenly, he felt the familiar weight of their gazes on him again. This time, though, it wasn't the same as it had been before. It was different, almost as if they were waiting for him to prove something. The moment he sat down, one of the boys from his class, Jake, leaned over and smirked at him. "Hey, man, I heard you were playing the piano the other day," Jake said, his voice filled with mockery. "What's that all about? Didn't know you were a piano prodigy." Jaden stiffened, but he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't going to let Jake's taunting get to him. He had worked too hard to let anyone bring him down now. Jake's smile widened as he saw Jaden's reaction, clearly enjoying the power he held. "What? You're not going to say anything? Come on, man, you're really going to sit there like you're too good for us?" Jaden's heart started to pound. He could feel the eyes of the entire class on him, and for a second, it felt like he was back in that place where he was invisible, where his voice didn't matter. But then he remembered the music. He remembered how it had felt to stand up for himself in the music room. And just like that, something clicked inside of him. Jaden leaned forward, meeting Jake's gaze without flinching. "I'm not trying to prove anything to you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm just doing what I love." Jake scoffed. "Right. Whatever, man. Just don't think you're too special all of a sudden. We're all just trying to survive this place, you know. No one's interested in your little piano sessions." Save it for the talent show or something. The word stung, but Jaden didn't let them show. He wasn't going to let Jake or anyone else define who he was. Just as he was about to turn away, Ms. Thompson entered the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The class immediately quieted down as she made her way to the front. Her eyes scanned the room, but for some reason, they lingered on Jaden for a moment longer than usual. "Today, we'll be having a special guest visit," she announced, her voice crisp. "I've invited Mr. Harris, our music department head, to come and talk to you all about the importance of pursuing your passions, no matter what they are. Jaden, I believe you've been exploring your musical talents lately. Why don't you come up and tell the class what it's been like for you?" Jaden's stomach dropped. The room went deathly silent as all eyes turned toward him. He hadn't been prepared for this. He hadn't been expecting to share anything with anyone, especially not in front of everyone who had already begun to judge him. But there was no turning back now. Jaden stood up, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, the tension thick in the air. As he made his way to the front of the room, he could feel the fear rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. This was his moment to be seen, not as the kid everyone ignored, but as Jaden, the one who was finally going to stand up and show the world who he really was. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. I've been playing the piano for a while now," he started, his voice a little shaky at first. "But it wasn't until recently that I realized how much it really means to me. It's more than just music. It's a way for me to be heard. I guess I've spent a lot of time feeling invisible, like I didn't matter. But playing, that's the one thing that makes me feel like I belong. It's the one thing I know I can do that's truly mine." The class remained silent, but Jaden could sense a change in the air. It wasn't the mocking tone that had been there before. It wasn't the jeering or the dismissive comments. No, there was something different this time. There was a quiet respect, a shift in the way they were seeing him. As he finished speaking, Jaden felt a strange calm wash over him. He had said it. He had finally said what he needed to say, and it didn't matter if anyone understood or not. What mattered was that he was finally being honest with himself, and with the world. Ms. Thompson, to his surprise, gave him a nod of approval, though her face remained impassive. "Well said, Jaden," she said simply. "It's important to remember that your passions are what make you unique. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." For the first time, Jaden felt like he had truly made his mark. The weight of the world didn't feel so heavy anymore, and the uncertainty that had been a constant companion in his life seemed a little less daunting. He wasn't alone anymore. He had spoken his truth, and that was all that mattered. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Jaden made his way back to his seat, his heart still racing but in a good way. His journey was far from over, but today, something had changed. He had taken the first real step toward finding his place in the world, and no one, not even Ms. Thompson or Jake, could take that away from him. The days that followed Jaden's confession in class seemed to pass in a slow, almost surreal rhythm. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in him, but in everyone around him. The students who had once whispered behind his back now offered him quiet nods in the hallway. Jake, the boy who had mocked him, still kept his distance, but the sharp, judgmental glances were gone. Even Ms. Thompson, who had been so cold and critical, seemed to treat him with a strange new respect. The real change, however, was within Jaden. The fear that had gripped him for so long, the fear of being judged, of being rejected for who he truly was, had started to fade. In its place, a new confidence was emerging. He wasn't the same boy who had stumbled into the music room months ago, uncertain and unsure of his worth. No, he had discovered something far more important, his own voice, his own power to choose how to define himself. One afternoon, Jaden sat in the music room once more, his fingers lightly brushing the piano keys. He had returned to his favorite instrument, the one that had given him a sense of belonging, a place where he could pour out his emotions and let his soul speak freely. He had spent the past few weeks practicing relentlessly, pushing himself to play better, to feel more, to explore deeper within the music. He had stopped worrying about what others thought and focused solely on the joy that playing brought him. Each note was like a small piece of his story unfolding, each chord a step closer to understanding himself. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just practicing for himself. He was preparing for the talent show. Ms. Thompson had approached him a week earlier, her tone unexpectedly warm. "Jaden, I've been hearing great things about your progress," she had said. "I think you should consider performing at the upcoming talent show. It could be a great opportunity for you to show everyone what you're really capable of." At first, Jaden had hesitated. The talent show was something he had never even considered. The idea of standing in front of an audience, playing the piano for everyone to see, was terrifying. What if they laughed at him? What if he made a mistake? But something inside him had clicked then, something that told him he couldn't let fear hold him back anymore. "I'll do it," he had told Ms. Thompson, surprising even himself. Now, as he sat at the piano, the reality of what he had committed to was starting to sink in. He could feel the nerves bubbling up inside of him, but they were different this time. Instead of paralyzing him, they fueled him. The anticipation was like a spark, urging him forward. The talent show was only a few days away, and Jaden knew that this performance was his chance to prove not only to everyone else but to himself that he was more than what they had thought of him. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about validation. It was about the courage to stand up, to share his gift with the world, and to let go of the self-doubt that had held him captive for so long. That night, as Jaden practiced, he began to think about everything he had gone through to get here. The ridicule, the moments of loneliness, the times he felt like he wasn't good enough, it had all led him to this point. Every challenge, every painful moment had been a stepping stone. He had learned that the path to self-acceptance wasn't easy, but it was worth every step. He had learned that his worth was not defined by anyone else's opinion. As he continued to play, he thought about the conversation he had with his mom that day. She had always been his biggest supporter, even when the world around him seemed to doubt him. Her words from that conversation echoed in his mind: "What you're doing is for you, not for anyone else. Don't let anyone's opinion take that from you." Jaden's fingers moved with more confidence now, his heart in sync with the music. He felt the rhythm deep within him, a pulse that matched his heartbeat. He was no longer just playing the piano, he was living the music, feeling each note vibrate through him, each chord an expression of his soul. As he finished the piece, he sat back, a small but genuine smile spreading across his face. For the first time, Jaden didn't just feel ready to perform, he felt empowered. The performance wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about sharing his truth through the music. The day of the talent show arrived, and the school gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, and parents, all gathered to watch the performances. Jaden stood backstage, his hands sweating but his mind clear. He could hear the other acts, singers, dancers, comedians, preparing, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was his moment, his music. Ms. Thompson found him just before he went on stage, offering him a rare smile of encouragement. "You've got this, Jaden," she said. "Just let the music flow." Jaden nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude toward her. She had been tough on him, yes, but she had also pushed him to believe in himself, to see his own potential. Without her, he might never have found the courage to take this step. When his name was called, Jaden walked out to the stage, the spotlight hitting him. He could hear the murmur of the crowd, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. He took a deep breath and sat at the piano. His hands rested lightly on the keys, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The audience, the fear, the expectations, none of it mattered. What mattered was the music. He began to play. At first, his hands were tentative, but as the music filled the room, so did his confidence. He let go of all the worries that had plagued him, pouring his emotions into each note, each phrase. The room seemed to fall away as the music took over. Jaden wasn't just playing a song, he was telling his story. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest, but the silence wasn't intimidating, it was expectant. Slowly, the audience began to clap, at first a few claps here and there, but then it grew. The applause was loud, warm, and genuine. Jaden stood up, his legs shaking, but a wide smile on his face. It wasn't about the applause, though it was nice. It was about knowing that he had done something for himself. He had overcome his fear. He had shared his music, his soul, with the world. And that was worth more than any praise he could ever receive. As Jaden made his way off the stage, he spotted his mom in the audience, her eyes filled with pride and love. He knew that this moment, this victory over his own self-doubt, was one that he would carry with him forever. He had done it. He had proven to himself that he was worthy of being seen. And in that moment, Jaden finally understood what his mom had always known: the power to believe in yourself was the greatest strength of all. The days after the talent show were some of the most exhilarating Jaden had ever experienced. He had walked off the stage to overwhelming applause, but the real triumph was internal. The overwhelming feeling of validation, of standing tall and proud for the first time in his life, had been more powerful than any applause or recognition he could receive. It was as if the walls that had surrounded him for so long had been torn down, and he was finally free to step into his own light. But what Jaden hadn't expected was the ripple effect that would follow his performance. At school, people began to treat him differently, respectfully. No longer the shy, invisible kid in the back of the room, he had become someone they saw, someone who had something to offer. It was as if the entire dynamic had shifted, and Jaden was no longer just the quiet kid who played piano in the corner. He was someone with a gift, someone whose story mattered. The first hint of this change came the day after the talent show. Jaden was walking down the hall when a classmate, Sarah, stopped him. She had always been a quiet observer, someone who rarely interacted with Jaden before, but now, she smiled warmly at him. "Hey, Jaden," Sarah said, her tone genuine. "That was incredible last night. I had no idea you could play like that. It was like magic." Jaden blinked in surprise. He had always been the last person anyone expected to stand out. He had never thought anyone would notice, let alone compliment him. "Thanks," Jaden replied, trying to sound casual, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "It was a little nerve-wracking, but I'm glad it went well." Sarah smiled again. "No, really. You were amazing. I've never heard anyone play like that." Jaden felt a wave of warmth flood through him. This was the kind of validation he had craved for so long, the kind that came from people seeing his talent, his true self, for the first time. That afternoon, during lunch, he noticed something even more surprising. A few of the kids who had teased him in the past, Jake, included, were sitting at the same table as him. They were talking and laughing, but there was a different tone to the conversation, one that wasn't mocking or dismissive. For a second, Jaden almost thought he had imagined it. But no, there they were, looking at him as if they saw him for who he was. Jake leaned across the table and gave him a small, almost sheepish smile. "Hey, man. That performance was legit. I didn't know you had it in you." Jaden raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to believe the sudden shift. Jake had never been kind to him before, and he wasn't about to forget the past. But instead of feeling suspicious or uncomfortable, Jaden simply nodded. "Thanks," he said again, this time with more confidence. "It means a lot that you're saying that." There was a pause, and then Jake spoke again, but this time his tone was more reflective. "You know, I think we all just didn't realize how much you were holding back. Maybe we were too quick to judge." The words hung in the air for a moment. Jaden wasn't sure what to make of them. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement, an admission that maybe, just maybe, they had all missed something important about him. It wasn't just Jake. That afternoon, as Jaden made his way to his next class, he found himself walking through the hall with a sense of something new, something that hadn't been there before. He wasn't invisible anymore. And in a strange way, it was the ripple of his performance that had created this shift. His courage to take that step, to stand up in front of everyone and show them who he truly was, had allowed others to see him in a new light. As he walked past a few more students, he caught snippets of conversations. "Did you hear Jaden play at the talent show?" one girl said. "I didn't know he had that in him," another responded. "Yeah, he's pretty amazing," came a third voice. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. For the first time in his life, Jaden wasn't the boy hiding behind the shadows. He was someone who belonged, someone who had something to offer the world. And that feeling, the feeling of being seen, was something that was beyond anything he could have imagined before. But with this newfound attention came new challenges. It wasn't that Jaden minded the change, on the contrary, he welcomed it. But as the weeks passed, he realized that the recognition also brought expectations. Some people, especially the teachers and even Ms. Thompson, began to treat him as a kind of prodigy, someone who had a unique gift they had yet to fully understand. And while that was flattering, it also felt like a weight on his shoulders. The more people saw his potential, the more he began to feel like he had to live up to it, to keep impressing them, to keep playing at the highest level. At times, it felt like the pressure was mounting, like a force he couldn't control. But in those moments, Jaden would return to the one place that had always been a source of comfort, the piano. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful day filled with conversations about the future of Jaden's music career, he sat at the piano once again, his fingers finding the familiar keys. As the first notes of a new melody filled the room, Jaden closed his eyes and let himself drift away, lost in the music. He realized then that his journey wasn't about living up to anyone's expectations. It wasn't about being a prodigy or a sensation, it was about the music, the freedom it gave him, and the way it allowed him to express the truth of who he was. The world could label him however they wanted, but Jaden knew the one thing that mattered: he had to stay true to himself. As the final note echoed in the room, Jaden smiled to himself. No matter where his path took him, he knew now that he had the power to choose his own story. He wasn't just a kid with a piano. He was a young man with dreams, with strength, and with the courage to go after them. And no one could take that away from him. The weeks following Jaden's performance at the talent show were a whirlwind. School became a different experience for him, no longer a place where he quietly hid in the background, but one where he was seen and noticed. People smiled at him in the halls. They asked about his music. And for the first time in a long time, Jaden didn't feel like he had to shrink himself to fit in. But as the attention continued, so did the pressure. The weight of expectation, while initially flattering, was starting to feel like a burden. His music teachers encouraged him to keep pursuing his piano skills, and some even suggested that he look into scholarships for specialized music schools. But Jaden wasn't sure he was ready for any of that. He loved playing the piano, but the idea of turning it into a career, or a performance routine, felt like too much, too soon. It was during one of these moments of self-reflection that Jaden's mom noticed his unease. She had always been his biggest supporter, but lately, she could tell something was off. "Jaden, you've been so quiet lately," she said one evening, sitting beside him on the couch. "Is everything okay?" Jaden didn't know how to explain it. How could he articulate the way his world had shifted overnight? The pressure, the attention, the sudden recognition, he didn't want to disappoint anyone, but he also wasn't sure what he wanted for himself. His fingers hovered over the keys of the piano, but his heart wasn't in it the way it used to be. "I don't know, Mom," Jaden finally admitted, rubbing his eyes. "It's just, everything feels different now. People keep saying I should do something with my music, like I should make it a career or something. But I don't know if that's what I want." I like playing, but it's mine. You know. His mom smiled softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. I know, honey. I know exactly what you mean. You're allowed to love something without having to turn it into a job. Music is a part of you, but it doesn't have to define you. What you need is to figure out what you want, not what anyone else thinks you should do. It's okay to take your time. Jaden let out a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest ease. His mom had always known the right thing to say, but now, more than ever, he realized how much he needed her support. For so long, he had been so focused on getting it right for everyone else, his classmates, his teachers, even the people who had doubted him, that he had forgotten what he truly wanted. The next day, Jaden made a decision. He would continue playing the piano, but he wouldn't let anyone's expectations shape his path. He wasn't ready to decide what came next. He needed time to discover his own direction, to enjoy the music without the pressure. He'd let the future unfold, one note at a time. At school, the changes in Jaden didn't go unnoticed. He continued to play his heart out whenever he could, but there was a new calmness in him. He didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. The whispers and rumors that had once filled the hallways seemed quieter now, as if his peace had somehow spread to those around him. One afternoon, as Jaden sat at his usual seat in the music room, he noticed something that took him by surprise. Ms. Thompson walked in, a familiar look of concern on her face. Jaden had grown used to her stern, demanding expressions, but today she seemed different, almost vulnerable. Jaden, Ms. Thompson began, sitting down beside him. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know I've been pushing you hard, too hard, sometimes. And I want to apologize if I made you feel like you had to live up to something. I was so focused on your potential that I didn't stop to ask what you wanted. Jaden blinked in surprise. He had never expected an apology from Ms. Thompson. She had always been so determined, so focused on helping him achieve his best. But hearing her say this made him realize something important. She wasn't just pushing him to succeed for her own sake. She genuinely wanted what was best for him. I've been feeling a lot of pressure lately, Jaden admitted. It's like everyone expects me to take my music to the next level, but I don't know if that's what I want. I love playing, but I don't want it to become something that I have to do, you know. Ms. Thompson nodded, her expression softening. I understand. And I'm sorry if I made you feel like you had to make music your career. It's okay to play for yourself, Jaden. No one is going to take that away from you. You've already shown that you have a gift, but the important thing is to remember that your journey is yours alone. Jaden let out a sigh of relief, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't just about the music, it was about being true to himself. Ms. Thompson wasn't telling him to chase fame or to become something he wasn't ready for. She was giving him permission to follow his own path, at his own pace. Over the next few days, Jaden began to feel a new sense of freedom. He returned to the piano with a renewed sense of purpose, but this time, it was different. There was no pressure to perform, no expectation to impress anyone. He played for the sheer joy of it, each note a reminder that his love for music was his own. And as he sat there, lost in the music, Jaden realized that he didn't need to have it all figured out right now. Life wasn't about rushing to the next step, or living up to others' expectations, it was about the journey, the growth, and the discoveries along the way. With each note that flowed from his fingertips, he began to embrace the unknown future, confident that no matter where it took him, he would have the courage to follow his own path. And that, Jaden realized, was the greatest gift of all. The excitement that had initially come from Jaden's newfound popularity had begun to feel heavier as time passed. For the first time in his life, he had people looking at him, waiting for him to do something spectacular. His teachers, his classmates, even some of the local community members, were all buzzing about his musical talent. It was a lot for a teenager who had spent most of his life blending into the background. Jaden had always been the quiet, reserved kid. His music was his escape, his outlet for self-expression. But now, it seemed like everyone had an opinion on what he should do with his talent. His peers expected him to perform more, to join clubs, to stand out even further. Teachers were suggesting private lessons, while some had even hinted at scholarship opportunities. The pressure to meet these expectations began to mount. Jayden didn't want to disappoint anyone, but at the same time, he wasn't sure he was ready for the path they seemed to be pushing him toward. One afternoon, after school, Jayden sat in his room staring at his piano, his fingers lingering over the keys but not playing. The music that had once come so naturally to him now felt like an obligation, and the joy he had once felt from playing seemed to be slipping away. He had always thought that music would be a constant in his life, but now, it felt like a heavy weight on his shoulders. He needed space to figure out what he really wanted, free from everyone else's expectations. He stood up abruptly, pushed the piano bench away, and grabbed his jacket. Jayden needed to get away from it all for a little while. Outside, the world seemed to have a calm, quiet beauty to it, as if the trees and sky were inviting him to take a breath. He walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, letting his feet guide him. It was a chilly evening, but he didn't mind the cold. It gave him time to think. His mind kept racing. What did he want out of all this? He had never been the type of person to thrive in the spotlight, yet now, it felt like the world was trying to force him into that very position. Music was still his refuge, but now, even that was tainted by the pressure to use it in a certain way. Jayden's thoughts drifted to his mom. She had been right, he didn't have to let others define his relationship with music. But now, he had to figure out how to make that happen. His love for the piano wasn't about fame or success. It was personal. It was about expression, emotion, and connection. But how could he reclaim that without the looming shadow of expectation? As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from his friend, Tyrell. "Hey, man. We still on for the jam session this weekend?" Jayden smiled a little at the message. Tyrell was one of the few people who had always accepted him without any conditions. He didn't expect anything from Jayden except for him to be himself. No pressure, no strings attached, just a couple of friends having fun. "Yeah, I'm down," Jayden texted back. "Looking forward to it." As he put the phone back in his pocket, he felt a sense of relief. Tyrell didn't care if he played a concerto or a simple tune. He just wanted to enjoy music with Jayden, pure and simple. That was exactly the kind of experience Jayden needed right now. The next few days went by in a blur. Jayden spent his time focused on school, but in the back of his mind, he was already looking forward to his jam session with Tyrell. That Saturday afternoon, they met up at Tyrell's house, a small place with an old, slightly out-of-tune piano in the living room. It wasn't fancy, but the atmosphere was laid back, relaxed, just the way Jayden liked it. They started by just playing random tunes, improvising with no real structure. The music flowed between them, an unspoken conversation through melody and rhythm. Jayden felt his worries begin to melt away as the sound of the piano filled the room, reminding him why he loved playing in the first place. No expectations, no pressure, just two friends creating music together. At one point, Tyrell stopped playing and leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "You know," Tyrell said with a grin, "you've got something really special, Jayden. You shouldn't hide that. People are gonna want to hear you play more. But that doesn't mean you have to do it on anyone else's terms. You play for you first. That's the secret, man." Jayden looked at him, taking in his words. Tyrell had a way of cutting through the noise, of simplifying things when they seemed too complicated. "You're right," Jayden replied, his fingers resting on the keys. "I've been letting all this outside stuff mess with my head. I just need to play for myself again. That's what got me here in the first place." The two of them spent the rest of the afternoon lost in their music, the room filled with the kind of effortless harmony that only true friends could create. And as Jaden played, he realized that Tyrell was right. He didn't have to chase anyone else's vision for him. He had his own path, and it was up to him to walk it. That evening, as Jaden walked home, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The pressure, the expectations, all of it had seemed so overwhelming just days before. But now, he saw them for what they were, temporary distractions. His love for music, the simple joy of playing, was what mattered most. When Jaden got home, he sat down at the piano once more, feeling the keys beneath his fingers. This time, he played with a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. No one was waiting for him to be something he wasn't. He could play what he wanted, how he wanted. And that was enough. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: Jaden was going to carve out his own path, one that was true to who he was. Whatever the world had in store for him, he knew now that he didn't have to face it alone. Music would always be there for him, a constant in a world that was anything but predictable. And for the first time in a long time, Jaden felt at peace with that. The following weeks brought more changes for Jaden. He had found his peace with music again, but it was hard to ignore the ripple effects of his previous performances. Even though he no longer felt the crushing weight of expectations, Jaden couldn't escape the fact that others still saw him as something more than he had ever imagined. His classmates continued to whisper about his talent. Even some of the teachers were starting to mention it in passing conversations. And although he had found comfort in the simplicity of playing for himself, there was a small part of him that couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. Could he truly shut out the rest of the world and just focus on his music? Or would he have to face the reality of performing and dealing with the expectations that came with it? One particular day in class, his music teacher, Ms. Reynolds, called him over after the bell rang. She had a slightly nervous look on her face, and Jaden immediately felt a pang of anxiety. Was she going to push him again, ask him to perform for the school? Was she going to urge him to join a music program? "Jaden," she began softly, "I know you've been a little distant lately, and I completely understand. But I wanted to talk to you about something." Jaden held his breath. The last thing he wanted was to be thrust into another performance, to have his name associated with something bigger than he was ready for. He opened his mouth, ready to decline any request, but Ms. Reynolds cut him off before he could speak. "There's a school recital coming up next month, and I've been thinking about asking you to perform. It's completely up to you, of course. I just think you have such a gift, Jaden, and it would be such a great opportunity for you to share it with the school. But only if you're comfortable." The words hit Jaden like a ton of bricks. The recital. It was a huge event in the school. Students from every grade performed, and it was a spotlight like no other. He could already hear the whispers, feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. The thought of it sent a wave of panic through his chest. He had come so far in reclaiming his love for music, but the idea of standing on a stage in front of everyone felt overwhelming. I don't know, Ms. Reynolds," Jaden stammered. "I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that. I love playing, but performing in front of a big crowd? I don't know if I can do it." Ms. Reynolds looked at him with understanding. "I get it, Jaden. I really do. It's a big step, and you don't have to do it if you're not ready. But I want you to think about it. This isn't about the crowd or the performance. It's about you and your music. It's an opportunity for you to share something personal, something beautiful. Just think about it, okay?" Jaden nodded, though his mind was a whirlwind. The idea of stepping onto that stage, with all eyes on him, made his stomach turn. He wasn't sure he could do it. But at the same time, there was a small part of him that wondered if this was the moment he had to face his fear. That night, he sat at his piano again, but this time, he wasn't playing just for himself. His thoughts swirled around the recital, the possibility of performing in front of an audience. What if it was too much? What if he messed up? He was scared, scared of failing, scared of the judgment, scared of not being good enough. But then, something clicked. Wasn't that the very thing he had been running from all along, fear of not being enough? For so long, he had tried to hide in the shadows, to be someone who didn't stand out. But maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to show himself, to prove that he could rise above his fears. Maybe the world wasn't going to judge him as harshly as he had feared. Maybe he didn't have to be perfect. The more Jaden thought about it, the more he realized that music wasn't just for him, it was meant to be shared. The recital could be an opportunity to do just that, to share the thing that made him feel whole, the thing that had always been a part of him. That night, he made a decision. He was going to do it. He was going to face his fear and perform. But on his terms. The days leading up to the recital felt like an emotional roller coaster. Jaden spent hours practicing, fine-tuning his piece, pouring his heart into every note. At the same time, doubt crept in. He was still afraid. The thought of standing in front of an audience, of possibly failing, gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the image of his classmates' eyes on him. The whispers, the judging looks, it was all too much to bear. But then, as he practiced, he remembered what Tyrell had said, "You play for you first." Jaden wasn't doing this for the crowd. He wasn't doing it for anyone but himself. The music was his expression, his voice. And if the crowd saw that, so be it. But it wasn't their approval that mattered. Finally, the day of the recital arrived. Jaden stood in front of the school auditorium, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the piano bench. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of voices from behind the stage. Students were nervously pacing, waiting for their turn to perform. But Jaden was paralyzed by his nerves. "Hey, you okay?" Tyrell appeared beside him, his easy smile offering Jaden a moment of relief. "I'm scared, man. I don't know if I can do this," Jaden admitted, his voice tight. Tyrell clapped him on the back. "You've got this. Just remember, it's about the music. Not about them. You've already shown you can play, now it's just about sharing that." Jaden nodded, taking a deep breath. As he walked on stage, he felt a surge of panic, but he pushed it down. He sat at the piano, placing his hands on the keys. The lights dimmed, the audience fell silent, and the music began. At first, his fingers felt stiff, unsure, but as the melody started, something amazing happened. The nerves began to fade, and all he could feel was the music. His fingers moved freely, gracefully, and the crowd melted away. It was just him and the piano, and in that moment, Jaden realized something important. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to worry about what anyone thought. This was his moment, and he was going to own it. As the final note rang out, the auditorium erupted into applause. Jaden blinked, surprised, not just by the response, but by the overwhelming sense of pride that washed over him. He had done it. He had faced his fear, and come out on the other side stronger. And for the first time in a long time, Jaden felt truly free. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jaden sat in his room long after the recital ended, still processing everything that had just happened. The applause, the recognition, the overwhelming sense of relief, it was all so surreal. The night had gone better than he could have ever imagined, but the feeling of standing in front of a crowd, sharing something so deeply personal, had left a lasting impression. When the final note had played and the crowd had erupted into applause, Jaden had frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The butterflies that had swarmed in his stomach were gone, replaced by a profound sense of accomplishment. He had faced his fear head-on, and instead of crumbling under pressure, he had thrived. The music had flowed through him as it always had, but this time, it felt different. He wasn't playing to hide anymore. He was playing to share. And that was the moment he realized something important. He didn't need to hide from the world. He didn't need to shrink back and remain invisible because of his insecurities. For the first time in his life, Jaden understood that his talent was meant to be shared. It was meant to be seen, heard, and appreciated, not just by others, but by himself as well. He had always been the quiet kid, the one who stayed in the background, keeping to himself. But now, everything was changing. The recital had been his first step, and though it had been terrifying, it had opened up a world of possibilities for him. As Jaden sat there, his fingers absently tapping out a rhythm on his desk, his phone buzzed on the bed next to him. He reached for it and saw a text from Ms. Reynolds. "Jaden, you were incredible tonight. You have a gift, and I want to help you make the most of it. Let me know if you're interested in taking things to the next level. The school's looking into some music scholarship programs, and I think you'd be perfect for it. Think about it." Jaden stared at the message for a long moment, his heart racing. A scholarship? He had never even considered that as an option. But now that it was in front of him, he had to admit it was tempting. A part of him wanted to run from it, to avoid the pressure of what came next. But another part of him, an unfamiliar, bold part, wanted to take the leap, to push himself further than he had ever dreamed. What was stopping him? Fear, he realized. The same fear that had kept him from performing in front of the recital audience, the same fear that had kept him from truly embracing his talent. But now that fear seemed so small, so insignificant compared to what he had just experienced. Maybe it was time to face that fear head-on again. He typed a quick response to Ms. Reynolds. "Thanks so much for the encouragement. I'll definitely think about it." Jaden didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was ready to embrace whatever came his way. The next day at school, the atmosphere was buzzing. Word had spread about the recital, and people were still talking about Jaden's performance. Some of his classmates were congratulating him, others were asking him how he felt, and a few even asked if he was planning to perform again. The attention was overwhelming, but Jaden felt a sense of pride he had never experienced before. He was no longer the invisible kid in the back of the room. He was seen. He was recognized. Even Ms. Reynolds had mentioned the performance in class the next day, saying, "Let's all take a moment to appreciate what Jaden did last night. Not just because he's incredibly talented, but because he had the courage to stand up there and share that talent with all of us. That's something we can all learn from." Her words left Jaden feeling both humbled and proud. He hadn't realized how much courage it had taken to perform, not just in front of an audience, but to share a piece of himself. The whole experience had been transformative. It wasn't just about music anymore, it was about stepping into the person he was meant to be, the person he had been hiding from all these years. After school, Jaden sat with Tyrell in their usual spot by the lockers. Tyrell was practically grinning from ear to ear, clearly proud of his friend. "You killed it, man," Tyrell said, bumping Jaden's shoulder playfully. "I knew you had it in you. Thanks, man. I couldn't have done it without you pushing me to face my fear. Honestly, I didn't even think I could get up there, but once I did, it just felt right." "That's because it was meant to be," Tyrell said. "You've got a gift, Jaden. And I don't just mean your talent with the piano. You've got the courage to back it up now. That's the hardest part." Jaden smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. He had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't believe in himself. But now, with Tyrell's words echoing in his mind, he knew that his journey was just beginning. The thought of pursuing music more seriously, the idea of scholarships, performing professionally, or even teaching others, was no longer a distant dream. It was a possibility. It was real. Jaden didn't know exactly where it would lead, but he was ready to take that next step. He knew he couldn't do it alone, but he also knew that, with his music and the people who believed in him, he could do anything. The future didn't seem so scary anymore. That night, Jaden found himself once again sitting at the piano, fingers gently pressing the keys. This time, the music wasn't an escape. It wasn't a shield to hide behind. It was a celebration. It was his future, his voice, and he was finally ready to let it be heard. As the final note of the song lingered in the air, Jaden smiled, knowing that whatever came next, he was ready. The world had never felt so full of possibility. In the weeks following the recital, Jaden found himself in a whirlwind of possibilities. Every day seemed to bring something new, a message from a teacher, an invitation to a music event, or a conversation with someone who had seen his performance and wanted to know more about his journey. It was a lot to process, but for the first time in his life, Jaden felt ready to face it all. The moment he had walked off that stage, his world had begun to change. The fear that had once held him back, the self-doubt that had clouded his every decision, was no longer as powerful. He was still nervous, still uncertain about many things, but he was no longer hiding from them. He was walking into them, head held high, ready to embrace whatever came his way. One of the first big changes came when Ms. Reynolds approached him again about the music scholarship. After their brief exchange on the night of the recital, she had reached out to him, encouraging him to consider applying. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a perfect opportunity. The scholarship could offer him the chance to develop his skills, maybe even get the chance to perform at a higher level, something he had never imagined before. "I know you're still processing everything that's happened, Jaden," Ms. Reynolds had said when they met to talk further. "But this scholarship could be the key to unlocking your full potential. Think of it as a chance to focus on what you love without the distractions of everything else. It's a great opportunity." At first, Jaden hesitated. The idea of committing to something so big, something so life-changing, was intimidating. But then he remembered how it felt to play on that stage, to share his music with others, to be seen and heard. Maybe this was his chance to step into a future he never thought possible. Maybe, just maybe, this was the push he needed to become the musician he had always dreamed of. "I'm ready," Jaden finally said, his voice steady with newfound confidence. "I'm ready to take this next step." Ms. Reynolds smiled, the pride in her eyes unmistakable. "I knew you'd get there. We'll work on your application together, and I'll make sure you have everything you need." As Jaden continued to wrestle with the idea of a future in music, he also started to find a new rhythm in his everyday life. His friends, including Tyrell, continued to support him every step of the way. Tyrell had always been there for him, but now their conversations went deeper. They talked about dreams, about the future, about the possibilities that were out there for both of them. Tyrell, too, had dreams of becoming a professional basketball player, but he saw in Jaden a unique potential that was worth celebrating. "You're really doing this, huh?" Tyrell asked one afternoon as they sat at lunch. Jaden had just told him that he was officially applying for the scholarship. "Yeah," Jaden said, feeling a sense of pride he'd never experienced before. "It's scary, but I know it's what I'm supposed to do. I'm not just playing to get by anymore. I'm playing to grow, to become who I'm meant to be." Tyrell smiled, his eyes full of genuine pride. "That's what I'm talking about, man. You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." It was moments like these, sitting with his best friend and talking about their futures, that made Jaden realize just how far he had come. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about believing in himself, about recognizing that he had a future worth fighting for. As the days turned into weeks, Jaden continued to prepare for his application. Ms. Reynolds worked closely with him, helping him refine his skills, selecting pieces that showcased his abilities, and encouraging him to be authentic in his work. She also helped him with the written portion of the application, guiding him through questions about his aspirations, his journey with music, and what he hoped to achieve. Jaden had never considered these questions deeply before, but now he found himself reflecting on his past in a way that was both empowering and humbling. He had spent so many years doubting himself, questioning whether he was worthy of pursuing something like this. But now, he could see how far he had come. His journey had been one of self-discovery, and he had learned that the only person who could hold him back was himself. "Your story is powerful, Jaden," Ms. Reynolds said one afternoon as they reviewed his application. "Don't be afraid to tell it. Your music speaks for itself, but your story adds the depth. You've had challenges, but you've risen above them. That's what makes your talent so remarkable." Jaden nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude toward his teacher. She had been his biggest supporter, pushing him when he doubted himself, and celebrating every little victory along the way. Without her guidance, he wasn't sure he would have had the courage to even think about applying for the scholarship. But now, it felt like the right next step. The day Jaden submitted his application was a milestone. It was more than just sending in an application, it was a symbol of his commitment to his future. It marked the moment when he chose to believe in himself, to trust that he had something valuable to offer the world. As he hit the submit button, Jaden leaned back in his chair and let out a deep breath. There was a feeling of calm that washed over him. No matter what happened with the scholarship, he knew one thing for certain: he had taken control of his destiny. But life wasn't just about what was next for him in music. He had learned to take pride in the small moments, too: the daily conversations with Tyrell, the practice sessions with his piano, the support from his teachers, and the quiet moments when he sat alone, letting the music flow through him. Jaden was no longer the quiet, unsure boy who had once been afraid to step into the spotlight. He was becoming the person he was meant to be, the person who could stand tall and say, "I'm here, and I have something to offer." And that was just the beginning. It wasn't long after that Jaden received a letter. He had been anxiously checking his mail every day, but when the letter arrived, he felt a nervous excitement building in his chest. He opened it carefully, the words blurring for a moment as he read through the lines. "Dear Jaden, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a recipient of the music scholarship." He had done it. Jaden had received the scholarship. His heart raced, a sense of disbelief flooding him. This was real. This was the beginning of something incredible. His eyes misted over as he looked at the letter, holding it tightly in his hands. He had done it. He had taken a chance on himself, and it had paid off. For the first time in his life, Jaden saw the future as something full of possibilities, and he couldn't wait to see where it would take him. Jaden could hardly believe what he was holding in his hands, the scholarship acceptance letter. His fingers traced over the words as if doing so would make the reality sink in. After years of being unsure of himself, of doubting his abilities, he had done it. He had been selected, not only because of his talent, but because he had stepped out of his shell and shown the world who he really was. The next morning, Jaden couldn't contain his excitement. He rushed into the kitchen, where his mom was making breakfast, the letter still clutched in his hands. "Mom," he shouted, his voice bubbling with energy. "I got it. I got the scholarship." His mom turned around, her eyes wide with surprise and joy. "What? No way. Are you serious?" Jaden nodded enthusiastically, his heart racing. His mom dropped the spoon she had been holding and wrapped him in a tight hug. "Oh, baby, I'm so proud of you. I knew you had it in you. You've worked so hard, and now look at you, this is just the beginning." Tears welled up in his eyes as he held his mom. For so long, she had been his rock, his source of strength. Now, he could feel that same strength fueling his belief in himself. This wasn't just his victory, it was theirs. As the day went on, the weight of the scholarship offer continued to sink in. Jaden couldn't stop smiling, and his friends, especially Tyrell, were ecstatic for him. "You did it, man," Tyrell said when they met after school. "This is big. The whole school's gonna be buzzing about it." Jaden laughed, but inside, he felt a mixture of excitement and fear. The future was still uncertain, still a world full of possibilities that were hard to imagine. He had spent most of his life as a quiet observer, unsure of where his place was in the world. Now, he was standing at the edge of something bigger than he had ever dared to dream. What's next? Tyrell asked, leaning against the lockers. Are you ready for all this? Jaden paused, looking down at the scholarship letter once again. I don't know, Ty. It feels like a lot. But I think I'm ready. Tyrell grinned. That's what I'm talking about. You've been ready for this since you first started playing. The first step toward the next chapter of his life came quickly. Ms. Reynolds organized a meeting with Jaden and his parents to discuss the details of the scholarship. As they sat in her office, she spoke about the different programs available to him and the various opportunities he could pursue. You've got a lot of options ahead of you, Jaden, Ms. Reynolds said, her eyes twinkling with excitement. This scholarship isn't just a chance for you to take music classes. You could be selected for special performance programs, master classes with renowned pianists, even internships with professional musicians. We're going to help you decide what the best fit for you is. Jaden's mind was spinning. There were so many paths he could take, and he was excited about each one of them. The idea of learning from master musicians, performing in front of even larger audiences, or even making a name for himself in the music world felt like an impossible dream that was suddenly within his reach. He looked over at his mom, whose face lit up with pride. She had always been his #1 supporter, and now, it felt like her belief in him had become a reality. Mom, Jaden whispered, I can't believe this is happening. She squeezed his hand. You've worked so hard for this, Jaden. Don't ever doubt that you deserve it. With the scholarship now fully in motion, Jaden began to prepare for the next steps. His mind raced as he thought about what the future would look like, but there was one thing he knew for sure, music was no longer just a hobby. It was his future. And it was a future he was ready to embrace. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of rehearsals, meetings, and decision-making. Jaden spent more time at the piano than ever before, practicing for upcoming performances and exploring new pieces that pushed his abilities further than they had ever gone. He worked closely with Ms. Reynolds, who helped him choose pieces for the upcoming music program, including a challenging Chopin nocturne that would stretch his skills and emotions. As the days passed, Jaden's confidence continued to grow. He was no longer afraid to take risks in his music, to challenge himself in ways he never thought possible. For the first time, he was truly performing from his heart, no longer hiding behind the safety of his past. His music had become a reflection of his journey, a journey that had begun in the shadows but was now stepping boldly into the light. But with all of the opportunities coming his way, there was one thing Jaden hadn't fully anticipated, the weight of expectations. Though his friends and family were incredibly proud of him, there was a pressure that came with success. Everyone had high hopes for him, his parents, Ms. Reynolds, his classmates, and even strangers who had heard of his talent. Jaden often found himself lying awake at night, wondering if he could live up to everyone's expectations. He was scared. Scared that he wasn't enough, that he would fail despite all the support surrounding him. In those moments of doubt, he remembered the recital, the moment when he had stepped onto that stage, terrified, but still managed to push through. That was his turning point. And he had to remind himself that no matter what happened, he had already overcome the hardest part, taking the leap. One evening, as he sat alone at the piano, playing through the nocturne, the weight of his worries began to lift. The music calmed him, just like it always had. He realized then that he didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to meet every expectation that others had set for him. All he had to do was keep playing, keep working hard, and trust that the rest would follow. As he played the final note of the nocturne, Jaden smiled to himself. He was ready for whatever came next. He had made it this far, and he would keep going. There was no turning back. The next day, he received another email. This one was from a prestigious music academy that had heard about his scholarship and was interested in having him audition. Jaden stared at the message, wide-eyed. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to chase them. The world was waiting, and Jaden was ready to take his place in it. Jaden's life had taken a dramatic turn, and it seemed as though each day brought with it another unexpected opportunity. After receiving the scholarship, he had grown more confident, but he had also become keenly aware of the weight of the choices ahead. His inbox was flooded with emails, each offering invitations to perform, collaborate, or even audition for various music academies. It was both exhilarating and overwhelming. One email in particular caught his attention. It was from the renowned New York Conservatory of Music, a place where the brightest musical talents from around the world honed their skills. His heart pounded in his chest as he read the details. The audition would be held in 2 weeks. He had a lot of work to do, but for the first time, Jaden wasn't scared. He had learned how to take risks. The young man who had once hesitated to take the stage now felt like he could conquer any challenge placed before him. He clicked the "Accept Audition" button before he even had a chance to think it through. When he told his mom about the invitation, her reaction was everything he had hoped for. "You're auditioning for the New York Conservatory? That's incredible," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "I'm so proud of you, Jaden. This is a huge step. You've worked so hard to get here. You've earned it." But Jaden felt a flicker of doubt. "Do you think I'm ready for something like this? What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough?" His mom smiled, walking over to him and gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "You've been ready for a long time, Jaden. You've always had the talent, the heart, and the drive. You're just beginning to see it for yourself. Now you have the chance to show the world what you can do. Believe in yourself, because I do." Her words were like a balm for his insecurities. He had always been his own toughest critic, second-guessing himself at every turn. But now, with his mom's support and the scholarship already under his belt, he felt ready to take on the world. Over the next week, Jaden threw himself into his practice routine. The audition for the New York Conservatory was no small feat. He would have to perform a selection of classical pieces, showcasing his versatility as a pianist. It wasn't just about playing the notes right, it was about conveying emotion, about telling a story through the music. It was a test of everything he had learned and everything he was still striving to master. He worked late into the night, running through pieces over and over again, honing his technique and developing his own interpretation of the music. The pressure was immense, but with each passing day, he felt himself getting stronger. Tyrell, ever the supportive friend, stopped by after school one afternoon, as he often did. "You've been at that piano all day," Tyrell said, chuckling as he saw Jaden hunched over the keys. "Are you trying to wear it out or something?" Jaden grinned, taking a short break to stretch his fingers. "Feels like it sometimes. I've got this audition in a few days, and I just need to make sure I'm ready." Tyrell leaned against the doorframe, looking at Jaden with a serious expression. "Man, I know you're stressing about this, but I'm telling you, you've got this. You've always had this. When you play, it's like nothing else matters. Just go out there and let the music do the talking." Jaden's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thanks, Ty. That means a lot." Jaden sat at his kitchen table, staring at the acceptance letter from the New York Conservatory of Music in disbelief. He had worked so hard for this moment, and yet it felt surreal. His dream had finally come true, but now that it was right in front of him, he couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. What did this new chapter really mean? Was he truly ready for this next step? His mom was busy in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared breakfast, but Jaden couldn't quite shake his nerves. The moment he'd been waiting for had arrived, but with it came an avalanche of new questions. Was he good enough to make it in a place like that? Would he belong in the world of professional musicians? Could he live up to the expectations of the conservatory, and everyone else who believed in him? As if reading his mind, his mom walked over to the table, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're looking at that letter like it's a foreign language, Jaden. What's going on in that head of yours?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Mom. I'm just scared. What if they realize I don't belong? What if I mess up? His mom sat down beside him, her eyes full of understanding. Jaden, listen to me, she said gently. You've worked your whole life for this. You've earned every bit of this. I know it's a big change, and I know you're scared. But fear is just a part of growing. Every great artist, every person who's ever succeeded, has faced those same fears. What matters is that you keep going, even when those fears try to hold you back. Jaden looked at her, his eyes softening. I want to believe that, but what if I fail? You won't fail, his mom said, her voice unwavering. Failure is part of the process. It doesn't mean you're not good enough. It just means you're learning, growing, and pushing yourself beyond where you've ever been before. You're more than ready for this, Jaden. You just have to trust yourself. Her words resonated deep within him. Trust. That's what he needed to do. Trust that he had what it took, that all the late nights at the piano, all the struggles, had prepared him for this moment. He could do this. He had already proven that to himself. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Jaden packed his bags, said goodbye to friends, and finished up his final performances at his school. He would soon be leaving his hometown and heading to New York, a city that seemed as big as his dreams and as intimidating as his fears. The conservatory would be a whole new world, one filled with the most talented, ambitious musicians in the country, all vying for a spot in the spotlight. Could he keep up? Could he stand out? But as he boarded the plane with his mom, a new feeling began to take over, excitement. The journey ahead was unknown, but it was his journey. And he was ready. Arriving in New York was a whirlwind. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and buzzing streets, was unlike anything Jaden had ever seen before. As the taxi drove them toward the conservatory, Jaden couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The streets were packed with people hustling and bustling, each person seemingly in their own world. Here, he was just another kid from a small town, about to step into a world of extraordinary talent. But deep down, Jaden knew he had something special, something the city couldn't ignore. The campus of the New York Conservatory was stunning. Tall buildings with sleek, modern designs stood side by side with historic buildings that housed world-class practice rooms and performance halls. His heart pounded with anticipation as he stepped into the main lobby, the weight of the moment hitting him full force. This was it. This was the place that would shape his future. He met his roommate, Tyler, a friendly but reserved young man from California. They hit it off right away, both of them feeling the nerves of starting something new. You're going to be fine, Tyler reassured him as they unpacked. Everyone here has their doubts at first, but we all have something to prove. Jaden smiled, feeling a bit lighter. Tyler's words echoed the same encouragement his mom had given him, and he realized that everyone around him had likely felt the same way when they first arrived. They were all here because they had talent, but more importantly, they had the drive to make their dreams come true. Jaden wasn't the only one who had come to prove himself. The first week was a blur of auditions, lessons, and meeting fellow students. It was overwhelming, to say the least. The conservatory had some of the finest instructors in the world, and the pressure to impress them was immense. Jaden spent hours in practice rooms, trying to perfect every note, every movement, but no matter how much he practiced, it felt like the goalposts kept moving. There was always something more to learn, something more to prove. One of his first classes was with Professor Leclerc, a renowned pianist and teacher who was known for his exacting standards. As Jaden sat down at the grand piano in the classroom, his hands trembled slightly. Professor Leclerc's sharp gaze seemed to weigh him down, as if every note would be scrutinized. Jaden took a deep breath and began to play. The piece he chose was one of his favorites, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was a piece he had played countless times, but this time, it felt different. The room was silent except for the sound of his fingers gliding over the keys, and Jaden felt the familiar surge of emotion that always came with playing this piece. It was as if the music was speaking for him, telling his story without words. When he finished, there was a long pause before Professor Leclerc spoke. "That was interesting," he said, his tone unreadable. "Your technique is solid, but there's a lack of connection to the music. The emotion is there, but it's not fully realized. You must learn to live inside the music, to breathe with it." Jaden's heart sank. He had worked so hard, yet it wasn't enough. But instead of feeling defeated, something inside him clicked. He wasn't here to simply play the notes perfectly, he was here to breathe life into the music, to make it his own. Professor Leclerc's words stung, but they also lit a fire within him. He wasn't going to let this defeat him. That night, Jaden sat at the piano in the practice room, determined to improve. He played the nocturne again, but this time, he focused not just on hitting the right notes, but on feeling the music, letting it guide him. It was as if a whole new world opened up to him. He was no longer just a performer, but a storyteller. The music flowed through him in a way it never had before. The next day, in his second lesson with Professor Leclerc, Jaden played the piece again. This time, when he finished, the professor's expression was different. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Much better. You've made progress. But don't stop here, keep pushing. Every time you play, dig deeper. Find new layers in the music." Jaden felt a surge of pride. He wasn't there yet, but he was getting closer. He had faced his doubts and his fears, and now, he could feel himself evolving. As the days went by, Jaden grew more comfortable in the conservatory. He still had doubts, still wondered if he truly belonged, but each small victory, the recognition of his progress, the encouragement from his professors, pushed him forward. He was on the right path. And with every note, he was telling his story. His journey was just beginning. The pressure of the New York Conservatory weighed heavily on Jaden. The city that had once seemed so exciting now felt overwhelming. The competition was fierce, and it felt like everyone around him was on a different level. As much as he tried to keep up with the relentless pace, doubts crept in every day. Could he truly be part of this world, or was he just an imposter? The morning air was crisp as he walked through the bustling campus, heading towards his next class. The autumn leaves swirled around him, but his mind was focused on the upcoming performance evaluation. Today, his technique would be put to the test. And every note would be scrutinized. Jaden had always prided himself on being able to handle pressure. Back in his hometown, he had faced enough challenges to make him stronger, losing his father, surviving in a city that never seemed to care about people like him, and learning to rely on his own willpower. But here, it was different. The standards were higher, the expectations unrelenting. Every student in his class was exceptional, and Jaden often found himself struggling to stand out in such a competitive environment. When he entered the performance hall, the familiar weight of anxiety settled in his chest. He hadn't had much time to practice his piece this week, the conservatory's demands had been relentless. And now, standing before his professors and peers, his confidence faltered. What if he stumbled? What if they saw through his facade and realized that he wasn't as good as they thought? Professor Leclerc stood at the front of the room, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on Jaden. "Ready, Jaden?" he asked, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of expectation. Jaden nodded, trying to steady his breath. He walked over to the piano, taking his seat, the weight of the room pressing in on him. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before he began playing. He had chosen Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a piece that had always been close to his heart. It was melancholic, brooding, emotions he understood well. But as his fingers moved across the keys, a wave of nervousness washed over him. The notes didn't come out as clean as he had hoped. His mind raced, trying to correct the mistakes in real time, but the more he tried, the worse it got. Each misstep seemed to echo in the silent room, amplifying his sense of failure. By the time he finished, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, their expressions unreadable. When the final note faded into silence, Jaden couldn't bring himself to look up. His fingers felt numb on the keys, his body frozen in place. He had messed up. He hadn't played it perfectly. And that felt like the only thing that mattered. Professor Leclerc's voice broke the silence. Jaden, you're technically proficient, but you've lost the soul of the piece. Beethoven's emotions don't come through when you're thinking about each note. You need to let go of your self-doubt and allow the music to carry you. It's not just about playing, it's about feeling. Jaden's heart sank. He had poured his soul into that piece, but it hadn't been enough. The doubt that had been bubbling inside him exploded. Was he really cut out for this? Could he ever be good enough to meet the conservatory's standards? His hands trembled as he rose from the piano bench and left the room, ignoring the concerned looks from his classmates. That evening, Jaden found himself alone in the practice room, his mind clouded with frustration. He had never felt so lost. All his life, he had used music as a way to express himself, to escape the pain of his reality. But now, it felt like his emotions were trapped in his fingers, unable to reach the keys, unable to speak the way they used to. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling the weight of his exhaustion. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this after all. Maybe he was just a small-town kid who had gotten lucky. He had always dreamed of being great, of making a name for himself, but what if it was all just an illusion? The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up to see Tyler standing in the doorway. "Hey," Tyler said quietly, leaning against the frame. "I could hear you playing. You okay?" Jaden forced a smile, but it felt thin. "Yeah. Just. I don't know. I don't think I'm good enough for this place. I made a fool of myself today." Tyler walked into the room and sat next to him. "Look, I know it's tough. I can see the way you've been working your ass off. But you've got to remember, man, nobody here is perfect. Everyone's struggling. Even the best get knocked down. The trick is to not let it define you. You have something no one else has, your heart. Your passion. You just need to trust that." Jaden looked at Tyler, but doubt still clouded his thoughts. "But it's not enough. I can't stop thinking about all the things I can't do. I'm just, not like everyone else here." Tyler shrugged. "You're not supposed to be like everyone else. That's the whole point. You bring something new to the table. You're unique. And that's what makes your music special." Jaden wanted to believe him, but the weight of his failure felt like a shadow that followed him everywhere. The next few days were a struggle. Jaden couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy, and his practice sessions became more about trying to prove something to himself than about truly connecting with the music. But no matter how hard he tried, his doubts lingered. One afternoon, after a particularly rough session in the practice room, Jaden decided to step outside for some fresh air. As he wandered through the campus, he found himself standing by the statue of Beethoven that stood in the middle of the courtyard. The wind ruffled his hair, and the city's hum seemed distant for a moment. He stared at the statue, thinking about the composer's life, how he had overcome so many obstacles, including his deafness, to create masterpieces that still moved people today. A thought struck him then: if Beethoven could overcome his challenges, why couldn't he? Jaden realized that what he had been missing wasn't technical perfection, but the ability to embrace the journey, the mistakes, the struggles, and the triumphs. Maybe he didn't need to be perfect to succeed. Maybe he just needed to keep moving forward, to trust that his heart would lead him where he needed to go. It wasn't about playing flawlessly, it was about playing truthfully. With a deep breath, Jaden smiled to himself. He was still learning, still growing. And maybe that was enough. That night, he returned to the practice room with a new sense of resolve. He sat at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, and instead of trying to force the music out, he simply let it come to him. He didn't worry about the mistakes or what others would think. He just played, playing for himself, for his journey, for the music. It was messy. It was imperfect. But it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Jayden felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The days following his breakthrough were filled with a mixture of determination and quiet reflection. Jayden was beginning to feel more at home in New York, but he was still haunted by the perfection that seemed to hang over everything at the conservatory. Everyone around him was so good, so accomplished. It was easy to feel like an imposter, especially when he thought about the expectations others had of him. But one thing was becoming clearer with each passing day: his music had to come from him, not from a place of competition or self-doubt, but from within his soul. Professor Leclerc's words still echoed in Jayden's mind: let go of your self-doubt and allow the music to carry you. He had spent too long thinking about the technicalities, about hitting every note perfectly. He needed to let go of his fear of imperfection and embrace the music, flaws and all. Music was about connection, not just to the notes, but to the emotions behind them. One crisp autumn afternoon, when the sky was dotted with clouds and the air smelled faintly of rain, Jayden had an epiphany. He was sitting in the practice room, alone, his fingers moving lazily over the keys as he began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece he had always found intimidating but beautiful. His hands weren't moving quickly, but rather thoughtfully, letting each note breathe as it was meant to. Slowly, as he let the music guide him, the anxiety that had held him captive for so long started to melt away. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was actually communicating with the music, not just playing it. When he finished, there was a moment of silence in the room. He sat back, his heart racing, not with fear, but with something else. Hope. He had done it. He hadn't focused on perfection. He had focused on feeling. He took a deep breath and smiled to himself. Maybe he wasn't meant to be the best. Maybe he was just meant to be himself. The next day, Jayden received an email that would alter the course of his journey. It was an invitation to perform at the conservatory's annual winter showcase, a prestigious event that attracted some of the most influential people in the music world. Jayden stared at the email in disbelief. This was his chance to prove to himself that he belonged here. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip by. He immediately called Tyler, who was practicing in his room. "Tyler. You won't believe this." Tyler, always the supportive friend, picked up immediately. "What's up?" "They want me to perform at the showcase," Jayden said, his voice filled with excitement and disbelief. "This could be my chance to show everyone what I can really do." Tyler's voice crackled with excitement on the other end. "That's incredible, Jayden. This is it, this is your moment." Jayden laughed, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. "Yeah, but I have no idea what I'm going to play. I've got a ton of pieces to choose from, but I don't know which one will really showcase who I am." Tyler was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It's not about picking the right piece. It's about how you play it. Just pick something that speaks to you, and make it your own. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Just trust yourself and your music." Jayden thought about Tyler's words. Trust himself. Trust the music. It wasn't about impressing others, it was about being authentic. For the next few days, Jayden threw himself into preparing for the showcase. He practiced for hours, experimenting with different pieces, but he always returned to the one that had brought him peace in the practice room, Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It wasn't an easy piece, but there was something about it that felt right. It told a story that resonated deeply with him, one of struggle, triumph, and vulnerability. It was his story. Every note he played felt like a conversation between him and the piano, each phrase building on the last. He found himself feeling connected to the music in ways he had never experienced before. For the first time, he wasn't just trying to master the piece, he was living it, breathing it, becoming it. The day of the showcase arrived, and the nerves were almost unbearable. Jayden stood backstage, dressed in his best black suit, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. The sound of the audience's chatter could be heard faintly through the thick curtain that separated him from the stage. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump. His mom had sent him a message that morning: "Remember, this is your moment. Own it. You've got this." As he read her words, a wave of calm washed over him. She was right. This was his moment. And he was ready. When the stage manager called his name, Jaden stepped forward, the spotlight momentarily blinding him. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, surrounded by a sea of expectant faces. He could see the judges in the front row, their eyes scanning him intently, waiting for him to make his move. But as Jaden walked to the piano, his nerves faded. He knew this piece. He had lived it. It was part of him. He sat down, taking a deep breath, and placed his hands gently on the keys. For a moment, the world seemed to disappear. There was no audience, no judges, only the music. As he began to play, the sounds of the piano filled the hall, each note ringing clear and pure. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. The emotion behind the music was what mattered. His hands moved confidently, and the passion he had been hiding for so long poured out of him, note by note. He let the music tell its own story, unencumbered by doubt. The performance was everything Jaden had hoped for. When the final note lingered in the air and the room fell into a deep silence, it was as if the entire audience had been transported into the music. There was no applause, just a moment of profound stillness. And then, as if on cue, the audience erupted into applause. Jaden looked up, his heart pounding, as he saw the admiration in the eyes of the judges and his peers. He had done it. He had finally played for himself, not for anyone else's approval, and in doing so, he had earned something more valuable than any award: he had earned his own respect. That night, as he walked back to his dorm room, Jaden felt lighter than he had in weeks. He had faced his fears, his doubts, and his insecurities, and he had come out stronger. He wasn't just a student at the conservatory anymore. He was an artist. And this was only the beginning. Jaden's performance at the Winter Showcase had become a turning point, but it was only the beginning of a much bigger journey. As he walked around campus in the days following his performance, he felt a shift within himself. The feeling of inadequacy that had haunted him for so long was gradually being replaced with something more empowering: confidence. For the first time since arriving at the conservatory, he was no longer thinking about the opinions of others. He had learned to embrace the process, to trust the music and, most importantly, to trust himself. Yet, despite his growing confidence, there was still one lingering shadow. Professor Leclerc's words, while encouraging, still echoed in his mind. "Let the music carry you." Jaden knew he had made progress, but he couldn't help but feel that he hadn't yet reached his full potential. There was still a sense of uncertainty, a quiet voice in his head that asked if he could truly rise to the challenge of becoming the pianist he had always dreamed of being. One afternoon, after class, Jaden found himself wandering the streets of New York, his mind restless. The city, which had once felt overwhelming, now seemed to offer him endless possibilities. He had learned to navigate the labyrinth of streets and subways, and every corner seemed to reveal something new. He passed a small, quaint cafe near Central Park, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting out into the crisp air. Something about the place called to him, and without thinking, he stepped inside. The cafe was cozy, with dark wood furniture and soft lighting that made it feel like a little haven from the hustle and bustle of the city. Jaden ordered a coffee and found a corner seat by the window, watching the people walk by outside. For a moment, the city seemed to fade away, and he felt a peaceful stillness settle over him. He pulled out his notebook, the one where he wrote down his thoughts and ideas about music, and began to scribble down some notes for his next performance. As he was lost in his thoughts, the soft sound of a piano drifted through the air, almost as if it had been waiting for him. Jaden's head snapped up, and he saw an elderly man sitting at a grand piano in the corner of the cafe, playing with a quiet yet confident grace. His hands moved fluidly across the keys, producing a beautiful, almost haunting melody. The sound was raw and emotional, but there was something more to it, something familiar about the way the man played. Jaden watched, transfixed, as the music seemed to wrap itself around him. The elderly man finished the piece, and for a moment, there was a profound silence in the cafe. Then, the room erupted into applause. Jaden, too, clapped, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something about the way the man had played that stirred something deep inside him. It was as if the music had come from a place beyond technique, beyond precision, something far more profound. The man looked up from the piano, his eyes scanning the room. When his gaze landed on Jaden, he gave him a small, knowing smile. "You play, don't you?" he asked, his voice warm and raspy. Jaden nodded, surprised by the question. "Yes, I do." "Then you must come and play with me sometime," the man said, gesturing to the piano. "There's a way to music that goes beyond the notes, young man. I can teach you if you're willing to learn." Jaden felt a mix of hesitation and curiosity. Who was this man, and how did he know so much about what Jaden had been struggling with? But there was something about the invitation that felt right, something that called to him. "I'd love to," Jaden replied, before realizing how much he meant it. The man chuckled softly. "Good. I'll be here most afternoons. Come whenever you feel like it." He paused for a moment before adding, "Name's Leo, by the way. Leo Thornton." "Jaden," he replied, offering a smile. "I'll be back, Leo." As Jaden left the cafe, his mind buzzed with excitement. Who was Leo Thornton? What had he meant by the way to music that goes beyond the notes? There was a magnetic quality to the man's presence, something that spoke to Jaden's own longing to go deeper into his art. The next few days passed in a blur of rehearsals and classes, but Jaden couldn't shake the memory of Leo's invitation. The idea of learning something new, something that wasn't focused solely on technique, was like a beacon of light in the midst of all the pressure and expectation at the conservatory. He had come to the city to grow as an artist, but there was still so much more to discover about himself and the music he played. On Thursday afternoon, he found himself standing in front of the small cafe again, his heart racing with anticipation. He pushed open the door, and the familiar warmth and smell of coffee filled his senses. Leo was sitting at the piano, his fingers gently caressing the keys, creating a soft, intricate melody. Jaden walked over and took a seat next to him, trying to remain calm. "Hi, Leo." Leo looked up and smiled, gesturing to the piano beside him. "I'm glad you came, Jaden. Let's see what you've got." Jaden felt a slight knot in his stomach, but the invitation was too tempting to resist. He sat down at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. He had no idea what to play, but he closed his eyes, letting his fingers move without thinking too much. He started with a simple melody, something familiar but not fully formed. As he played, Leo's voice interrupted the music. "Don't think about the notes, Jaden. Let them speak for themselves. Play from here," Leo said, tapping his chest. "The music comes from inside you, not from your fingers." Jaden's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand." Leo smiled knowingly. "Don't worry. Just play, and I'll guide you." Jaden hesitated for a moment, then closed his eyes again. He let his fingers fall to the keys, not trying to control the sound but allowing the music to emerge naturally, as if from a deeper place inside him. At first, the notes were disjointed, unsure. But as he continued, something shifted. The melody started to come together, not perfectly, but with a raw, honest emotion that felt different from anything he had ever played before. When he finished, Jaden opened his eyes to find Leo watching him, his face filled with approval. "That was much better," Leo said, nodding. "You didn't think about it, did you?" Jaden shook his head, still amazed at how freeing it had felt. "I just let it happen." Leo smiled. "Exactly. That's the magic of it. The music is always there, waiting for you to find it. You just have to trust it. For the first time, Jaden felt like he was tapping into something deeper, something far more meaningful than he had ever expected. Leo's approach was unlike anything he had been taught at the conservatory, but in that moment, Jaden knew it was exactly what he needed. The music had always been there, within him, it was just waiting to be set free. As Jaden left the cafe that afternoon, he couldn't help but feel like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The city, the conservatory, and the competition no longer felt so daunting. For the first time, he wasn't just playing to impress others. He was playing for himself. And that made all the difference. The weeks following his meetings with Leo became a turning point for Jaden. The small, unassuming cafe had become his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the pressures of the conservatory and rediscover the joy of playing without judgment. With every lesson Leo gave him, Jaden began to unravel layers of his musical identity that he hadn't known existed. He was learning to play with freedom, to express himself more honestly, and most importantly, to stop overthinking every note. Leo's teachings were unconventional compared to what Jaden had been taught at the conservatory. While his professors emphasized technical precision and mastery of classical repertoire, Leo's approach was grounded in emotional connection to the music. He taught Jaden to embrace imperfections, to play with passion rather than striving for perfection. It was a concept that, at first, Jaden found difficult to accept. After all, he had been raised in an environment that celebrated precision over expression. But as Jaden spent more time with Leo, he began to see the value in this new perspective. Each session felt like a journey of self-discovery, both musically and personally. Leo's wisdom wasn't just confined to the piano, it seemed to extend into Jaden's life as well. He started to understand that music, much like life, wasn't about being perfect, it was about being authentic. One rainy afternoon, as Jaden walked into the cafe, he found Leo already seated at the piano, playing a simple, haunting melody. Jaden quietly took a seat beside him, closing his umbrella and shaking off the dampness from the rain. Leo didn't acknowledge his arrival at first, as if he were lost in the music, but Jaden didn't mind. He had come to appreciate these quiet moments, where words weren't necessary. After a while, Leo finished playing and turned to him with a knowing smile. "How are you feeling, Jaden?" he asked, his voice warm and steady. Jaden thought for a moment, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "I feel different," he said finally. "Like I'm starting to understand what it means to truly play." Leo nodded, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "That's good. You're beginning to let the music speak through you. You're not just playing the notes, you're living them." Jaden leaned back in his chair, processing Leo's words. For the first time, he felt like he was understanding music on a deeper level, not just as an art form, but as a way to communicate with the world. He was no longer focused on what others thought of him or how well he could perform. He was learning to play with his heart, not his ego. As they continued to talk about music, Leo's voice took on a more reflective tone. "You know, Jaden, music has a funny way of showing us who we really are. It's not just a skill, it's a reflection of your soul. And when you truly let go of the need to be perfect, that's when the music becomes something greater." Jaden was quiet for a moment, taking in the profound simplicity of Leo's words. He had always associated success with perfection, whether it was in his music or in life. But now, as he sat there in the dimly lit cafe, he realized that his journey wasn't about being the best. It was about being true to himself, letting go of his fears, and trusting that the music would find its own way. For the first time, he wasn't measuring his worth by how others saw him. Instead, he was finding value in his own expression. A few days later, Jaden had a chance to put everything he had learned into practice. The conservatory had announced another performance opportunity, this time, an intimate recital for a small group of donors and influential figures in the classical music world. It was a significant event, and there was no doubt that Jaden would be expected to deliver a technically flawless performance. His professors were excited about the prospect of him performing for such an esteemed audience, and the pressure was palpable. But for Jayden, it was no longer just about impressing the people in the room. It wasn't about adhering to the exact standards of technical precision that had once dominated his thoughts. Instead, it was about connecting to the music in a way that felt honest and true. He had been practicing tirelessly, but he had also been working on letting go of the fear that had plagued him for so long. He wasn't going to play for approval. He was going to play because it was what he loved, and because it was the only way he knew how to truly express himself. The day of the recital arrived, and Jayden felt the familiar nerves start to creep in. He stood backstage, watching the other performers go before him, each one seemingly perfect in their delivery. The fear of failure threatened to return, but he quickly shook it off. He had a job to do, and it wasn't to impress anyone. It was to share his music. When it was his turn, he walked onto the stage with a calm confidence that surprised even him. The grand piano awaited him, its polished surface gleaming under the stage lights. As he sat down and adjusted the bench, Jayden took a moment to center himself, drawing a deep breath. He glanced out at the audience, an intimidating sea of well-dressed, discerning faces. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He was ready to play for himself, not for them. He began with the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece he had struggled with so many times before. But this time, something was different. Instead of focusing on the technical aspects, Jayden let the music flow through him. He allowed himself to feel every note, to let each phrase resonate deeply within him. It was imperfect, but it was his, raw, emotional, and authentic. As the piece progressed, Jayden's connection to the music deepened. The nerves that had once gripped him faded into the background, replaced by a sense of peace. He wasn't playing for validation. He was playing to tell a story, to communicate something real and unfiltered. When the final note lingered in the air and the last echoes of the music faded away, the audience was still. The silence in the room was profound, and for a brief moment, Jayden wondered if he had failed to make an impact. But then, the applause came, a slow, building wave of appreciation that crescendoed into a standing ovation. Jayden stood up, bowing deeply, his heart swelling with emotion. He had done it. Not perfectly, but honestly. And that, in itself, was more than enough. As he walked off stage, he felt lighter than he had ever felt before. He had learned to trust himself, to embrace the imperfections, and to play from the heart. The music had carried him, just as Leo had taught him. And in that moment, Jayden realized that his journey was no longer about proving himself to others. It was about becoming the artist he had always wanted to be, someone who played with passion, authenticity, and freedom. The rest, he realized, would follow. Jayden's life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. It wasn't just about playing the piano anymore, it was about the journey he had taken to get to this point, and the deeper understanding of music and himself that he had uncovered along the way. As he looked back on his time at the conservatory, he marveled at how far he had come. He had entered the prestigious institution as a young, uncertain student, weighed down by fear and self-doubt. Now, he was a different person, more confident, more attuned to the music he played, and more grounded in who he was as an artist. The standing ovation at his recital had been a turning point, but it wasn't just the applause that had moved him. It was the realization that he had played for himself and not for the approval of others. The music had flowed naturally, effortlessly, and in that moment, he had truly felt connected to it in a way he had never experienced before. It wasn't about technical perfection, it was about expressing something deeper, something raw, something real. As the weeks passed, Jayden continued to meet with Leo whenever he could. Their lessons became less about the mechanics of playing and more about the philosophical aspects of music. Leo had opened his eyes to a world beyond notes and rhythms, to the deeper emotional currents that ran beneath the surface of every piece of music. He had learned to see music not just as something to be played, but as a language, one that spoke to the soul, one that could communicate across boundaries, and one that could bring people together. One late afternoon, as the winter semester came to a close, Jaden made his way to the cafe, eager to meet Leo for their usual session. He had just received news that he was being considered for a coveted position in an international piano competition, an opportunity that could change the trajectory of his career. His professors were excited for him, but for Jaden, it was a different feeling. He wasn't nervous anymore. He wasn't afraid of failing. In fact, he didn't feel the pressure he had once felt about competing. He knew that whatever happened, he had already won. The growth he had experienced, the lessons he had learned from Leo, and the music that had become a part of his soul, that was success. When Jaden entered the cafe, he found Leo sitting at the piano, just as he always did. This time, however, there was something different in the air. Leo looked up as Jaden approached, his face more serious than usual. "Jaden," Leo said, his voice calm but firm. "I have something important to tell you." Jaden sat down next to him, his heart suddenly racing. "What's going on, Leo?" Leo turned to face him, his eyes filled with a depth of understanding. "I think you're ready, Jaden. Ready for the next step." Jaden blinked, taken aback. "The next step?" Leo nodded slowly. "You've learned everything I could teach you here in this little cafe. You've discovered the essence of music, the rawness of it. But now it's time for you to go beyond. It's time for you to step onto a bigger stage and show the world what you're made of." Jaden's breath caught in his throat. "I don't understand." "You mean, the competition?" Leo's smile was almost imperceptible, but it carried a quiet confidence. "Not just the competition, Jaden. It's about showing up for yourself. You've learned that the music is about connection, not validation. Now, you have to take everything you've discovered and share it with the world." For a long moment, Jaden was silent. The weight of Leo's words settled in his chest, and he could feel the truth of them. It wasn't just about the competition or the accolades. It was about taking all the knowledge he had gained and putting it into practice. It was about giving himself permission to succeed and to fail, without the pressure of perfection. He was ready, in ways he hadn't been before. "I understand," Jaden said softly. "I'm ready." Leo smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "Good. And remember this, Jaden, the world will always have expectations. But the most important thing is that you play for yourself. If you do that, everything else will fall into place." Jaden nodded, his heart full. The fear and uncertainty that had once plagued him were gone. He was no longer playing to please others or to prove something to anyone. He was playing because he loved it. He was playing because it was his truth. The competition came and went, and Jaden's performance was nothing short of extraordinary. He didn't win first place, but something far more valuable had been gained in those moments on stage. He had stepped into the music, allowed it to carry him, and shared his soul with the audience. The feedback from the judges was glowing, not because of his technical skill, but because of the emotion he had infused into every note. They saw in him something rare, something real. After the competition, Jaden's life began to change. He was offered opportunities to perform in prestigious venues around the world. But no matter where his career took him, he always remembered the lessons Leo had taught him, the importance of authenticity, the power of vulnerability, and the understanding that music was not about perfection but connection. And as Jaden sat down at the piano in the cafe one last time, looking out over the city that had become his home, he realized that this journey had been more than just about becoming a better pianist. It had been about becoming a better person, a better artist, and a better human being. In that moment, Jaden knew that he had found something far more precious than success or fame. He had found his voice. And that was the greatest gift of all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?